Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. Reflection of darkness. The night over Los Angeles was stifling, the city glowing with neon lights, but in certain corners, there was a darkness that concealed something unspeakable. The Cecil Hotel loomed over the street, its old walls having witnessed more horrors than anyone could imagine. It was here that Clara Gray, a young journalist, had arrived, intending to spend a few nights in room 412 to uncover the secrets surrounding this place, which seemed to be entangled in a web of mystery. After leaving her bag by the entrance, she ran her fingers along the cracked wall of the hallway, which smelled of age and stagnant dust. The administrator, a thin man with deeply sunken eyes, handed her a key, looking at her as if he wanted to say something important but changed his mind. "If anything, don't go out at night," he muttered, lowering his gaze. Clara nodded and headed for the elevator. Inside the cabin, the air felt heavy, and the floor buttons were worn down from repeated presses. She pressed 4, but instead of moving upward, the elevator paused for a moment, then other buttons lit up, 2, 6, 10. Clara's heart tightened. She had heard of the elevator game, which supposedly opened doors to other dimensions. When the doors opened on the second floor, the hallway was dark. Or was it? A faint light flickered somewhere at the end. She quickly pressed the closed door button but felt something barely graze her arm. The elevator jerked and shot upward. Finally, when the doors opened on the fourth floor, Clara stepped into a dimly lit corridor covered in a worn carpet with mysterious stains. Somewhere deep within, there was a clicking sound, like the unlocking of a door. The journalist glanced around, but saw no one. She quickly found her room, inserted the key into the lock, and entered. The room was cold, despite the heat outside. The window opposite was slightly open, and the curtains, though there was no wind, barely moved. Setting her things on the table, Clara pulled out her laptop and opened a file with notes. She wanted to reconstruct the events of the night Alice Lem disappeared. The cameras had recorded her in the elevator. The girl seemed to be hiding from someone, waving her arms as if speaking to an invisible companion. Clara watched the video again, and her skin broke out in goosebumps. In one of the frames, in the reflection of the elevator doors, she noticed a shadow. It hadn't been there before. The journalist ran her hand across the screen as if she could erase the terrifying sight. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the window. She spun around. There was no one outside, but what was that mark, resembling a wet handprint? Clara stepped back, her breathing shallow. She decided to check the hallway. Opening the door, she saw a dark figure at the end of the corridor. It was tall, unnaturally long, and seemed to sway. The figure took a step forward, and the hallway seemed to narrow. Clara slammed the door shut and locked it. At that moment, water began to seep from under the door. She recognized that water. It was the same kind found in the water tower after Alice Lem's death. And it was dripping from her own faucet, though she hadn't turned it on. In the bathroom, the mirror trembled, as though someone was touching it from the other side. Clara grabbed her phone, but the screen lit up with a message, "Open." Her fingers clenched around the phone, her heart racing wildly in her chest. She took a step back. The mirror trembled more violently. Then there was a whisper. "Open. I know you're here." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, repeating that it was just her imagination, but the voice became clearer with each passing moment. The water continued to flow, growing darker by the second. Suddenly, everything went silent. She cautiously opened her eyes. In the mirror, she saw herself, but not herself. Her reflection was smiling, and her eyes were dark voids. It reached out through the glass. Clara screamed. Clara recoiled from the mirror, her breathing shallow, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She tried to steady herself, but her legs were trembling, and her hands had turned to ice. Her reflection. It couldn't be real. It was something else. Something that had emerged from the darkness of this cursed hotel. She wanted to run out of the room, but the door handle wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed. Panic seized her as she heard a faint sound outside the door, as if someone's bare feet were sliding across the old carpet. Rustle! Rustle! Someone was out there, and that someone was getting closer. Clara began frantically searching for something heavy to defend herself. The room only contained an old armchair, a dresser, and a television. She grabbed a metal lamp, gripping it tightly in her hands. A knock at the door. 1.2.3. She froze. Her mind screamed in alarm, making her heart leap into her throat. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice trembling, though she didn't want to know the answer. Silence. And then, "Open!" The whisper came not from behind the door. Clara shuddered. The voice was coming from the mirror. She slowly turned, and horror tightened around her throat again. The reflection was no longer smiling. It mimicked her movements, but with a split-second delay. Its eyes remained black, like voids that could swallow anyone who looked too long. The reflection suddenly tilted its head, as though it had heard something. Then it did the thing that made Clara's breath catch in her chest. It raised its hand and knocked on the mirror's surface. 1.2.3. Exactly the same way the knocks had sounded just moments ago at her door. Clara clutched the lamp and took a step back. "This can't be real," she whispered. At that moment, the light in the room flickered, and the mirror cracked, as if a fracture had run across it. Water began to seep from its edges, trickling down the frame and leaving dark streaks on the floor. And then Clara's reflection changed. Instead of her, another girl stood there. Her skin was pale, almost bluish, her eyes wide open, filled with terror. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face. She looked familiar. Clara held her breath. It was Alice Lem. Suddenly, her arms shot forward, and the glass shattered into thousands of shards. Black water surged from the mirror, engulfing Clara. She gasped for air, trying to stay on her feet, but something grabbed her wrist. Cold fingers. They pulled her into the darkness. She tried to scream, but the water filled her lungs. The last thing she saw before being sucked into the black whirlpool was Alice Lem's face, dissolving in the waves. In the morning, a hotel maid knocked on the door of room 412. Hearing no answer, she took the key and unlocked the door. The room was empty. But on the floor, next to the shattered mirror, there was a large puddle of water. And on the fogged-up glass of the window, 3 words were written in trembling handwriting. "She found me." The next day, Detective Adam Cross stood in room 412, examining every detail. The Cecil Hotel had once again become the site of a disappearance, and he was no longer surprised. The file in his hands contained dozens of similar cases. People arrived, stayed for a few nights, and simply disappeared. But this case was different. Unlike the others, Clara Gray had left a trail. Notes, videos, even social media posts. She had been investigating the hotel's mystery, writing about the death of Alice Lem, and then, she found something. Something that shouldn't have seen the light of day. The detective surveyed the room. Everything seemed almost normal. Old furniture, cracked walls. But the floor was still damp, even though there were no leaks in the room. And most notably, the shattered mirror. He bent down and picked up a shard of glass. It was cold, as if freshly taken from a freezer. There was something strange on its surface, the imprint of a palm, but it seemed to be from inside the glass. The detective tensed. What the hell happened here? Behind him, there was a rustling sound. He quickly spun around. The hallway was empty. But the elevator doors were open. Cross slowly approached and peered inside. Something in him felt that this was the wrong place. That something otherworldly was happening here. But as a rational man, he didn't believe in ghosts, cursed hotels, or evil spirits. Then, the light in the elevator flickered, and he saw her. A woman stood in the farthest corner of the cabin. Pale, wet, with empty black eyes. Cross froze. She raised her hand and slowly pressed a button. The elevator jerked and began to descend. The detective stepped back, pulling out his gun. The elevator doors closed, and silence once again filled the hallway. But just before they fully closed, he heard them whispering to him. "She found me." Detective Cross wasn't the type to get easily scared. He had seen plenty of horrifying things in his career. Bodies lying in the alleyways of Los Angeles, shattered lives, the cold indifference of death. But now, standing before the closed elevator doors, he could feel something invisible wrapping around his throat. It felt as though the air had become heavy, saturated with a dampness that smelled of decay. Cross took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "This is nonsense," he whispered to himself. "I'm just tired." But he knew that was a lie. The elevator no longer descended. The floor indicator was stuck on 1, but the doors didn't open. It was as if someone, or something, didn't want to come out. The detective forced himself to tear his gaze away from the elevator and turn back to room 412. But as soon as he touched the doorknob, it felt like an electric shock. It was ice cold. A sound came from inside the room. Drip, drip, drip. Like water slowly dripping from a faucet. Cross tightened his grip on the gun and pushed the door open. The room greeted him with gloom. Though the lamps were still on, the light seemed muted, dim, as if it was being swallowed by some invisible darkness. And then he saw it. The bathroom. The door was ajar, and water was trickling out, pooling into a dark puddle on the floor. His gut screamed, "Don't go in." But he went. Cross cautiously pushed the door open and froze. The bathtub was completely filled with water. But this wasn't just any water. It was black, oily, like something from the depths of the ocean where no light reached. And in the middle of this horrifying abyss, there was a body. Dead eyes stared upward, the mouth slightly open as if the victim had tried to take one last breath before dying. Cross took a step back, but the body slowly turned its head toward him. Its mouth opened wider, and black water poured out. The detective scrambled back, tripping over the edge of the sink, and a hand shot out of the water, grabbing his wrist. Cross screamed, pulling his arm free. But the hand didn't let go. Its claws dug into his skin. And then he heard it. A whisper, laced with hatred, hunger, malice. "She found me. She found me. She found you." With all his strength, Cross yanked his arm free. He fell to the floor, and when he looked back at the bathtub, it was empty. No body. Only black water slowly draining down the drain. The detective trembled, trying to catch his breath. And then, the closet door behind him creaked open. Someone was standing there. And he knew he couldn't turn around. But the voice in his head whispered, "Turn around." Cross held his breath. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the surrounding sounds. The closet doors behind him creaked wider. The darkness inside was thick, like black tar. And something was there. He couldn't see it, but he felt it. The cold spreading through the room, he knew deep down that someone was standing behind him, waiting for him to make a mistake. A faint sound came from inside the closet. Click, click, click. Like nails scratching against wood. Cross could have just run. But something kept him in place. An invisible force gripped his legs, as if icy tendrils of fear were wrapping around him. And then IT spoke. The voice came from the very darkness of the closet, low, ominous, layered with other voices, as if several people were speaking at once. "You will stay here too." Something yanked him back sharply. Cross screamed, trying to break free, feeling invisible fingers clutching his shoulder. He spun around, raising his gun. But the closet was empty. Only the doors slowly swayed, creaking faintly. The detective took several heavy breaths. He needed to get out of there. He took a step toward the exit. Then the light went out. The room was engulfed in impenetrable darkness. And in that darkness, the sound came again. Click, click, click. Now it was coming from all sides. Cross tightened his grip on the gun, his finger already on the trigger. "Who are you?" he rasped. The answer came right beside his ear. "I've always been here." Something lightly touched his neck. Cross fired. The flash of light split the darkness for a second, and he saw her. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her long, wet hair clung to her face. Her eyes were black, like holes in reality. Her mouth stretched into the grimace of an inhuman smile. And her hands, they were already reaching for him. The darkness swallowed the room again. Cross lunged for the door, but it wouldn't open. A quick rustling came from behind. She was moving. He fired again into the darkness. And then everything went silent. Suddenly, the light returned. The detective stood in the middle of the room, breathless, with the gun still in his hands. But he was alone. No signs of a struggle. No bullet holes. No one. Only on the mirror which hung opposite him, something was written. In trembling handwriting. In black water. "You're one of us now." Cross felt the blood freeze in his veins. And then, in the mirror, his reflection smiled. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.